Rain had come softly over Redwood Hollow that morning, a cold mist sweeping through the evergreens and settling like breath on the damp wooden porches. The small Oregon town, nestled between the shadowed arms of forested hills and fed by the slow drift of the Alder River, stirred with its usual quiet rhythms. But one truck, old and rust-patched, rolled up the gravel drive of a weathered cabin that hadn't seen life in nearly a decade. It creaked to a halt beneath a sagging pine, and the woman inside stared through the windshield for a long moment before killing the engine. Officer Clara Hayes, 34, was not the kind of woman who entered a room unnoticed, despite her quiet presence. She was tall and broad-shouldered, her posture straightened by years of uniformed command. Her hair, a thick chestnut brown, was tied back into a loose bun that had seen better mornings. Faint scars traced along her left jawline and down her collarbone remnants from the explosion outside Kalispell that had nearly ended her career and her life 6 months prior. Her expression was often unreadable to strangers, stoic, focused, but to those who knew her before the accident, there was a subtle shift, a silence that no longer felt like peace, but wariness. She stepped out into the drizzle, boots sinking slightly into the moss-lined gravel. The scent of wet earth, pine resin, and memory hit her in a single wave. The cabin was her parents' old place, left to her in a will she hadn't had time to read properly until last month. They'd both died years ago, her mother from cancer, her father in a logging accident. She'd avoided the place ever since, but now it felt like the only place left that wasn't trying to pull her back into chaos. The screen door squeaked open under her touch, the interior still lined with old photos, quilted throws, and the ghosts of simpler years. A single box sat on the kitchen counter, labeled in her own block handwriting. Discharge, medical, personal. She didn't unpack it. Instead, she poured herself a mug of black coffee, opened the back door, and stared at the trees like they were waiting to speak. Redwood Hollow hadn't changed much. The same 2-lane road looped past the post office, the diner, and Sheriff Braden's office. But as Clara pulled on her canvas jacket and headed into town, she noticed the campaign signs littering every fence and sidewalk. Whitman for truth, Whitman for safety. It made her jaw tighten. Mayor Thomas Whitman, mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair and perfect teeth, had always been a man who spoke too smoothly. He wore suits in a town of flannel, always polished, always rehearsed. He'd been rising in the ranks, eyeing a congressional seat now. But Clara knew better than most that what glimmered in public often rotted in private. She parked beside the general store and headed toward the bulletin board outside Town Hall. That's where she saw it. Retired Canine Auction. This Saturday, Valor, 9YO male German Shepherd, former service dog of Redwood PD, available to the public. Her hand froze mid-reach. The words blurred slightly in the rain, but the name burned clear. Valor, her partner. The same dog who had taken shrapnel shielding her in the blast. The same dog she'd trained with, served with, trusted in life-or-death moments more than she had any human. He wasn't just a dog. He was her shadow, her compass. She'd been told he'd be placed in retirement care, somewhere safe. Instead, they were auctioning him off like second-hand furniture. "Clara?" The voice came from across the street. A man in his 60s, lean and sun-tanned, with a beard gone mostly silver and a Carhartt jacket patched at the elbow, stood beside a pile of lumber tied in the bed of his truck. Emmett Rowe, retired deputy and Valor's original trainer. He walked with a slight limp and a quiet strength, eyes sharper than his years suggested. "You're really back." She nodded, the paper still clutched in her hand. "They're auctioning him, Emmett. Valor." "I know," he said, sighing. Saw the notice last week. Thought maybe you'd already been told. No one told me a damn thing, she muttered, jaw set. Emmett rubbed the back of his neck. It's politics. You know how that goes. Whitman's trying to clean house before the election. Make it look like the department's lean and transparent. Retiring assets, including dogs. Valor's not an asset, Clara said. He's family. Emmett's gaze softened. You want to fight for him? Damn right I do. He hesitated before adding, then you'll want to know. Dalton Hayes is the top bidder so far. Clara stiffened. Hayes? That name. He's not from town. Moved in last year. Says he runs an environmental logistics firm. No one's seen the books. Real slick type. Rumors say he's Whitman's silent partner. A cold pulse ran through her. And he wants Valor? Emmett shrugged. Some say for security. Others think it's about leverage. You and Valor saw things. Maybe more than they liked. Clara didn't answer. She stared out across the lot where campaign signs fluttered in the wind like warnings. Something told her this was bigger than a dog. But for now, it started with one. That evening, she drove back to the cabin in the fading gray, headlights slicing through mist that never seemed to lift. She sat on the porch with her coffee going cold, staring into the woods. Rain fell again, light, persistent. A promise of the long Oregon winter to come. Inside, she pinned the auction flyer above the fireplace. Valor's name etched itself into her thoughts like a pulse. She remembered the last night before the explosion. He'd rested his head on her lap, eyes closed, trusting her to keep him safe. Now, it was her turn. She didn't know who was behind it yet. Whitman, Hayes, someone else. But they'd made a mistake. They'd tried to bury a bond forged in fire. And she'd dig it up, one broken lie at a time. The drizzle had turned to a steady, unhurried rain by morning, wrapping Redwood Hollow in a blanket of mist and wet bark. Clara Hayes stood beneath the overhang of the town hall, her canvas jacket soaked through at the shoulders, her fingers clenching the hem like she could wring answers from it. The flyer for the K9 auction was still pinned to the bulletin board, curling at the edges. A cold wind swept through the square, scattering a few leaves and rattling the old bell above the general store. She had barely slept. Valor's name had echoed in her mind like the pulse of a wound reopened. She'd spent most of the night pacing the creaking floorboards of her parents' cabin, trying to find a legal loophole, some forgotten clause, anything that would let her claim him before it was too late. But Redwood's police regulations were rigid, and Mayor Whitman made sure they stayed that way. At precisely 9:00 a.m., she pushed through the door of the municipal building, rain trailing behind her like a shadow. The front desk was manned by Denise Barlow, a woman in her late 40s, with curly gray-streaked hair and a pair of glasses always slipping down her nose. Denise had worked there since Clara was a teenager, and her voice was the same, a little nasal, a little too cheerful. "Clara, back in town for good?" Clara nodded curtly. "I need to speak to whoever's handling the K9 auction. Now." Denise blinked, caught off guard. "Well, that'd be Chief Walters. He's in a meeting, but—" Clara didn't wait for the rest. She was already moving down the narrow hallway, boots echoing off linoleum. Chief Roger Walters was not a bad man, just an exhausted one. In his mid-60s, overweight with a stiff knee and deep worry lines etched under his eyes, he had served Redwood Hollow for almost 4 decades and had grown more tired of politics with each passing year. He looked up as Clara barged into his office. "Clara, Jesus, you don't knock anymore." "You're selling Valor," she said flatly. "I saw the flyer." He gestured for her to close the door and sighed, folding his hands over a stack of reports. "It wasn't my call. Mayor Whitman's initiative downsizing non-essential assets. Valor's considered retired. He's not a filing cabinet. He's a war-trained K-9, my partner. And you're no longer active duty, Roger said, his voice softer. He's department property now. Rules are rules. Screw the rules. Let me adopt him, Roger. Off record. Private handover. No one has to know. Clara, he leaned back, rubbing his temple. I can't. Whitman insisted on public auction, full transparency, no exceptions. This is personal. For him too, Roger muttered under his breath. Clara froze. What does that mean? But the chief only looked down, signaling the conversation was over. Outside, the sky had darkened further. Clara didn't head straight home. She needed to move, to think. Instead, she drove the long curve of Aspen Road, past the ranger station and through the pine woods that separated downtown from the outskirts. Half a mile past the bridge, she turned off onto a gravel path and pulled up in front of a modest barn with hand-hewn beams and a carved wooden sign that read, Rowe and Daughter Carpentry. She knocked once on the sliding door. Emmett Rowe answered, wiping sawdust from his flannel. His graying beard was damp from sweat and rain, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His face softened when he saw her. Let me guess, they said no. She stepped inside without answering. The barn smelled like cedar and varnish, warm and earthy. You were right about Dalton Hayes, she said. Whitman's protecting something. Emmett leaned against the workbench. Hayes has been buying up properties, old warehouses, even the feed mill by the river. Says he's expanding logistics, but no one's seen a truck or a shipment, not once. What does he want with Valor? Clara asked. He's not a watchdog. He's trained to detect organophosphates, hydrocarbons, even nitrates. Hayes runs clean on paper. Maybe that's the point, Emmett said. Clean on paper, dirty behind the curtains. Valor's a threat if someone knows what to ask him to sniff. Clara stared at the dust-dappled light streaming through the high windows. I'm not going to let them take him, auction or not. Emmett crossed his arms. You'll have to outbid Hayes, and he's got money, real money. Clara said nothing, but her jaw clenched. That night, she opened her father's old gun safe and counted the emergency fund $3,000 in savings, no more. She stared at the stack of bills like they might multiply. On instinct, she returned to the folder from her discharge. Commendations, medical reports, a copy of Valor's K-9 file. She flipped through it until she found what she needed. A handwritten note from the Army vet who'd evaluated Valor's recovery. It read simply, still bonded, still capable. Recommend placement with Officer Hayes pending reassignment or retirement. That bond, it seemed, no longer mattered. Just before midnight, she grabbed her flashlight and drove to the old station. The building was dark, fenced off since the new precinct had opened across town, but the back gate still opened with a shove. She walked slowly toward the kennel yard, boots crunching on wet gravel. And there he was, Valor. He lay curled in the back of the enclosure, head raised, ears alert. His coat was still rich black and tan, though more silver dusted the snout now. His amber eyes caught the light and held hers with the same calm certainty that had once made her breathe easier under fire. Hey, old boy, she whispered. He rose slowly and stepped toward the fence, tail wagging in a low, hesitant rhythm. She knelt, hand through the bars. His nose pressed into her palm. They forgot what you did for them, but I didn't. And as rain began to fall again, she sat with him, hand on fur, hearts beating through chain-link silence. The air inside the auction hall was stale, thick with sweat and damp coats, the wooden rafters strung with faded county fair banners from summers long past. Rain ticked against the tin roof like a slow drum roll, steady and ominous. Clara Hayes stood near the center aisle, just left of the podium, hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket, pulse thrumming like a siren in her ears. Around her, folding chairs scraped across the concrete floor as townsfolk jostled for better views, not of her, but of the cage positioned beneath the spotlight at the front of the stage. Valor. He was lying down inside the crate, chest rising slow, ears pricked forward. His fur was damp, flecked with gray now, especially at the muzzle. But there was no mistaking the tension in his body, the subtle twitch of muscle, the alert readiness beneath his stillness. He looked out over the crowd, and then, as if drawn by something deeper than scent or sound, his eyes found Clara. A flicker passed between them. Recognition, memory, trust. The auctioneer cleared his throat into the mic, a stocky man with a red vest and sweat on his brow. Ladies and gents, thank you for coming to the annual county surplus auction. Our next item is of special interest. Former K-9 Valor, 9 years of service, trained in scent detection, narcotics, hazardous materials, and search and rescue. Currently retired. We'll start the bidding at $1,000. Clara's hand tightened around the envelope in her coat, $3,000 in cash folded neatly inside. It was everything she had. Across the room, a man rose slowly from a front row seat. Dalton Hayes, late 30s, tan coat, polished boots, black hair slicked back too cleanly for Redwood Hollow's usual crowd. His face was sharp, symmetrical, and bland in the way that always screamed power without responsibility. He nodded once, raising a gloved hand. 1,000. Clara stepped forward. 1,500. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. We have 15? Any advance? Dalton didn't even look at Clara. 2,000. Clara's voice stayed steady. 3,000. A murmur rippled through the hall. It was rare to see any bid hit that fast, let alone from someone not dressed like a millionaire. Clara stood firm, her boots wet from the puddles near the door, eyes never leaving Valor's. Then, from the opposite side of the room, another bidder raised his hand. Travis Redman, representing Omnitech short, wiry, balding with an ill-fitting blazer and an expression like a ferret who'd lost his stash. 3.5. Clara's heart dropped. She recognized his face from old reports. Omnitech's so-called logistics consultant, a mouthpiece. She had nothing left to raise. In the back corner of the room, Rosie Rowe tugged at the sleeve of her too-big raincoat, the hood slipping off her small red curls. The 7-year-old had snuck in quietly with Emmett, who now leaned against the wall near the entrance. Emmett hadn't noticed when she slipped her disposable camera out of her coat pocket earlier, an old Kodak model with duct tape across the back. Rosie loved capturing grown-up secrets, as she called them, and a few minutes ago she'd caught one. Just outside, before the auction began, she'd seen Dalton pass a thick envelope to Officer Kurt Delaney, a lanky man with a sunken jaw, tired eyes, and a habit of chewing gum like it owed him money. Rosie had aimed her camera carefully, pressed the shutter, and felt a little shiver of something exciting and wrong. Now, inside, she crouched behind a chair, fiddling with the crank, ready for another shot if something else strange happened. Back on the stage, the auctioneer hesitated, eyes darting between the bidders. "Do I hear 37? Dalton raised a brow, clearly annoyed. 4,000. Omnitech's Travis smiled slightly. 5. Clara's throat tightened. This wasn't about the dog anymore. They were buying silence. Valor shifted inside the cage, head rising higher now, eyes locked on her again. 6, Dalton said smoothly. Clara's legs felt like stone. Her breath shallowed. From behind her, Emmett moved forward, whispering urgently, "I can try to match them. Give me a few hours." "No time," Clara whispered. They're driving it higher on purpose. On stage, the auctioneer cleared his throat again. 6,000 going once? A soft voice came from the back of the room. 8? Every head turned. Rosie had stepped into the aisle, holding her little camera at her side. She stood beside Emmett now, chin high, cheeks pink, eyes bright with a kind of courage only children possess. She repeated herself. 8,000. The auctioneer blinked, dumbfounded. Miss, Emmett stepped in quickly. She means us. Emmett Rowe and family. Dalton turned his head, a small smirk forming. You really want to play this game? Clara stepped forward, louder this time. Why do two corporations want an old dog? He's not a showpiece. Travis Redmond shrugged. Sentimental value. Dalton folded his arms. Security training purposes. The lie hung in the air like smog. The auctioneer looked uneasy. 8,000 going once. Dalton finally lifted his hand. 10. It landed like a slap across the room. Gasps sounded. Someone in the back whistled low. Emmett's shoulders slumped. The auctioneer's voice cracked. 10,000, do I? Rosie's voice piped up again. You're cheating. She held up her camera. I saw you give money to Officer Delaney. I took a picture. Silence collapsed over the crowd. Officer Delaney, who had been standing near the exit, turned pale. Clara stepped toward Rosie and gently took her shoulder, nodding toward the auctioneer. I believe we have a problem with the integrity of the process. The crowd began to buzz. Several people stood, craning to see. The mayor wasn't present, but his name was already being whispered. Dalton didn't move, but his jaw ticked. The auctioneer hesitated, finally setting down the gavel. We'll pause the auction for review. Rosie looked up at Clara and whispered, Did I do it right? Clara knelt beside her, hand over the girl's. You did perfect, kiddo. And in the cage, Valor's tail thumped once against the metal floor. The silence in the auction hall was no longer still. It trembled with tension, a collective breath held between outrage and disbelief. The suspended gavel sat like a forgotten relic on the podium. Clara stood motionless near the center aisle, one hand resting protectively on Rosie's small shoulder, the other gripping a photograph that could dismantle the illusion everyone had been sold. But all of that faded in her mind as her eyes locked with Valor's through the crate door. He hadn't taken his eyes off her. Then came the sound metal, groaning under pressure. Valor stood up. His head dipped slightly as if testing the latch, and then with a practiced shift of his body, he slammed his shoulder against the cage wall. A sharp clink echoed through the hall. Gasps, shouts, a scraping of chairs. Somebody restrain that dog, someone yelled. But no one moved. Another slam. The latch cracked open. And then, with a grace that seemed both regal and primal, Valor stepped out of the cage and onto the stage floor. He didn't rush, he didn't bark. He walked like a soldier coming home. His soaked, black and tan fur shimmered under the harsh ceiling lights, and every step echoed louder than the murmurs in the crowd. The auctioneer backed away, nearly tripping on his own feet. Dalton Hayes, sharp-suited, smug, perfectly still stared in silence, his jaw tense. Travis Redmond of Omnitech adjusted his glasses nervously, stepping backward, but Valor didn't look at either of them. He walked toward Clara. When he reached her, he stopped, raised one paw and placed it gently against her thigh. His eyes met hers with the same unwavering calm that had steadied her hand in combat, and in that moment it was no longer about bidding wars or legal loopholes. It was about a bond that no amount of money could buy. Rosie whispered, barely audible, "He chose." Before anyone could respond, the back doors burst open with a bang. Officer Ben McCrae entered, rain on his jacket, face flushed from the cold. He was in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut and the kind of earnest demeanor that made him both dependable and occasionally naive. He took in the scene and escaped K9, a crowd frozen in awe, and Clara standing like a beacon in the middle of it all. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, hand near his holster. "The dog broke loose," someone offered weakly. "No," Clara said firmly. "He broke free. There's a difference." Ben's eyes moved from Clara to Valor, to Dalton, and then Travis. "I was told this auction was clean, official." Clara raised Rosie's photograph into the air. "Official doesn't mean honest. There's proof now. Bribery. Corporate interference. This isn't about retiring a dog. It's about keeping him away from people who ask the wrong questions." Dalton's voice cut through the noise, smooth and cold. "That dog is property of the department. What you're suggesting is theft." "He's not a desk chair," Clara shot back. "He's a living witness." Emmett Rowe, standing near the back, finally stepped forward. His worn flannel shirt was still damp from the rain, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and stayed silent too long. "I trained that dog," he said, eyes fixed on Dalton. "He can detect chemical traces most labs miss. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You don't want Valor sniffing around your business." Ben hesitated, visibly torn. "If there's an accusation, it has to go through channels." "Channels?" Clara said. "How many times have those channels buried the truth? Look around you. Look at him." She gestured toward Valor, who sat calmly at her feet, eyes scanning the room like he was still on duty. "He's telling you everything you need to know." The auctioneer, now pale and visibly sweating, looked to Dalton for guidance. Dalton said nothing. His expression had settled into a hard, calculating mask. Travis Redmond shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly wishing he were anywhere else, and then Rosie stepped forward, holding out her envelope of photos. "I have more," she said simply. Ben took them, flipping through the images, Dalton handing an envelope to Officer Delaney, Travis unloading containers from an unmarked van. His jaw clenched tighter with each image. "This goes straight to Internal Affairs," he said at last. "No delays, no edits." "Not this time," Clara added. "It all comes out. We do this in the open, or it doesn't get done." The auctioneer cleared his throat, but his voice had lost all authority. "What do we do with the dog?" Clara looked at Valor, then back at the crowd. "He's not the dog. He's Valor, and he's coming home." No one moved to stop her as she turned and walked toward the doors, Valor trotting beside her like he had done 100 times before. Outside, the rain had thinned into mist, softening the edges of the world. The sky was a pale silver, clouds breaking apart like old secrets finally giving way. Clara paused at the edge of the parking lot. Rosie ran to catch up, holding Valor's leash loosely in her small hand. "He didn't like the way they smelled," Rosie said, voice small. Clara glanced down. "You noticed that too?" Rosie nodded. He looked at them different. Emmett joined them, his boots crunching over wet gravel. "This isn't over, Clara." "I know," she said, watching Valor sniff the wind. "But it's a start." She didn't know where the trail would lead, only that it began with Valor and she'd follow. The wind had picked up by the time Clara pulled her truck into the overgrown access road behind the old Omnitech storage site. The sun hung low, caught behind a haze of gray clouds, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of storm water running through rusted pipes. Valor sat in the passenger seat, alert but calm, his eyes scanning the tree line like a soldier surveying familiar ground. His thick coat, once groomed and glossy, now bore the signs of a working dog returned to duty damp around the neck, streaked with mud along his flank. He was 9 years old, but the power in his frame hadn't diminished. If anything, something in his posture felt sharper now, like memory had returned to muscle. Clara shifted the truck into park and stepped out, boots sinking into soft earth. "This is where it all started," she muttered. The warehouse ahead of them was long abandoned, its aluminum siding rusted in streaks, windows either boarded or shattered. This was the last known location she'd been assigned to before the explosion. The official report called it a containment breach. She'd never bought that explanation. And now, with Valor's reaction at the auction, she had more reason than ever to dig deeper. Behind her, Emmett's pickup rumbled to a stop. He stepped out, stretching his back with a grunt. His usual flannel was replaced by a thick canvas jacket, stained at the sleeves, and he carried a metal detector slung over one shoulder. "You sure it's safe? I mean, relatively speaking?" "I'm not sure of anything," Clara said, "but we have to try." Emmett handed her a small soil testing kit. "Figured you'd want to take samples." They moved toward the rear of the warehouse. The ground was soft, almost marshy in places. Weeds burst through cracks in the old concrete. Valor kept close, nose down, ears twitching. And then, near a cluster of disused barrels and partially buried rubble, he stopped. His whole body stiffened. Tail raised. He growled low. Clara knelt beside him. "What is it, boy?" She reached out and sifted through the earth with gloved fingers. The soil was dark, but not just with moisture, it had an acrid, unnatural smell. She scooped a portion into a vial, then opened the testing strip. A minute later, the color changed red. "Organophosphates," she whispered, "just like the old training days." Emmett frowned. "Why is that still here? This place was supposed to be cleared." "It never was," she said, "just like I suspected." Valor circled the area twice more, sniffing with precision. Each time he returned to the same spot. Clara marked it with a stake and looked toward the warehouse. "We need to get inside." Back at the cabin, as the sky darkened and rain began to spit against the windows, Rosie sat on the floor with her back against the fireplace, a blanket wrapped around her legs, and Valor curled up beside her. She was quiet, sketching with a red pencil on a notepad while Clara examined soil reports at the table. "You said your mom worked for Omnitech?" Clara asked. Rosie nodded without looking up. "She used to come home smelling like vinegar and burnt wires." Clara glanced up. "What was her name?" "Dana. Dana Lorne. She was a biologist, but she didn't wear a lab coat. She wore jeans and a ponytail and always had dirt under her fingernails." Emmett, leaning against the doorframe, looked over. "You never mentioned her name before." Rosie shrugged. "No one ever asked." Clara turned to her laptop and typed into the public employee database. Nothing. No record of Dana Lorne under Omnitech's staff history. She tried again through the state registry. Nothing. She turned to Emmett. "It's like she never existed." "That can't be," Emmett muttered. Clara narrowed her search to older PDF archives and eventually found a single reference in an outdated environmental permit from 4 years ago. "Here," she said. "Dana Lorne, listed as independent consultant. No follow-up, no exit record." Rosie looked up finally, her voice smaller than before. "She never said goodbye. One day she just stopped coming home." Clara sat back, heart heavy. They erased her. Emmett's brow furrowed. Why would they cover up a biologist's disappearance? "Because she found something she wasn't supposed to," Clara said, eyes drifting to Valor. "And I think she tried to warn someone." Rosie reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, beat-up notebook. She used to write notes in this. I found it under the floorboard in her studio. Clara took it gently. The cover was cracked, the pages water-stained, but inside were sketches of chemical structures, scattered notations, and a series of GPS coordinates. She was tracking something, Clara said, flipping through, and Omnitech didn't want her to finish. Just then, Valor lifted his head from Rosie's lap and let out a single bark short, deliberate. A figure appeared outside the window. Emmett grabbed the lantern and opened the door. A woman stood in the mist, mid-30s, athletic build, pale from the cold, her black rain jacket soaked through. Her eyes were dark and watchful. She carried herself like someone who had spent years staying invisible. "Ivy Monroe," she said simply. "I'm a journalist, and I think you're in a lot more danger than you realize." The morning after Ivy Monroe's arrival came with a sharp wind and a warning sky, the kind of pale, washed-out light that never quite committed to sunrise. Clara stood at the edge of the old Omnitech warehouse's east wing, a crowbar gripped tight in her gloved hands. The rusted floor had buckled in places, warped from years of moisture and rot, and moss clawed its way through broken tiles like time reclaiming what was hers. Behind Clara, Emmett crouched low, brushing away debris near the far wall, while Rosie, bundled in a too large army coat and rubber boots, sat cross-legged near a cracked window, sketching quietly with a broken pencil. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust, but Valor stood rigid, tail raised, head cocked as he sniffed toward a sagging patch of floor near an old drain. The moment his body tensed, Clara knew. He's got something. She crossed the space in a few quick steps. Valor let out a low, guttural growl, his first in years, and dug at the ground with both front paws. Not panicked. Focused. Clara and Emmett exchanged a glance. "That the same smell as before?" Emmett asked. "Stronger," she said, and drove the crowbar into the floorboards. It took nearly 10 minutes of careful prying and elbow grease before the wood gave way. Beneath, buried beneath an old layer of concrete and soil, lay a rusted metal box about the size of a footlocker, reinforced with thick bands and a latch so corroded it crumbled at her touch. Clara pulled it up with a grunt, setting it carefully on the nearest intact surface. Emmett crouched beside her, brushing dust away. "Looks military grade?" Clara nodded. "Or stolen from somewhere that used to be." With a snap, she opened it. Inside were several glass vials, each sealed with wax and labeled with crude strips of masking tape. Dates and symbols, no names. One had a cloudy amber liquid. Another, something that shimmered faintly blue in the dim light. Tucked alongside the vials was a leather-bound journal, its cover stained and warped. Rosie stepped closer, wide-eyed. "That's hers," she whispered. "That's my mom's notebook." Clara handed it to her gently. "Are you sure?" "She always wrote on the inside cover," Rosie said, flipping it open. There, faded but legible, "Property of Dana Lorne. If found, please return to Rosie." The little heart beside her name looked like it had been drawn by a trembling hand. Clara sat down on a broken crate and began thumbing through the entries. The handwriting was frantic, slanted pages filled with diagrams, tables, and frantic lines of thought. Test 37 shows tissue degeneration at 12 hours. Subjects exposed via groundwater routes. Unauthorized compound introduced into tank B. Who signed off on this? Then underlined 3 times. They're using live animals. Field testing, no approval. Her stomach turned. This is what she found, Clara muttered. And this is why she disappeared. Emmett stood up, his face pale. "You think they buried her to keep it buried?" Clara looked down at the vials. "No, I think they buried her because she didn't let it stay hidden." Just then, Valor barked sharp and loud. His hackles rose and his body coiled tight, not toward the hole, toward the exit. He bolted out into the weeds without hesitation. "Valor!" Clara shouted, racing after him. They emerged from the rear of the warehouse, following the blur of black and tan darting between trees and underbrush. Clara sprinted, Emmett not far behind, until Valor skidded to a stop near a chain-link fence that surrounded a small auxiliary building. The sign on the gate read, "Property of the Office of the Mayor. Authorized entry only. Whitman's campaign headquarters." Clara ducked low behind a stack of crates as Valor growled at the sealed metal door. The stench was stronger here. Even without training, Clara could smell it now. Acrid, chemical, and artificial. The same scent from the buried vials. Emmett crouched beside her. "They're storing it here?" "Or mixing it," Clara said grimly. She took out her phone and snapped several photos of the door, the warning labels on the side panel, and the ventilation pipes that ran straight out the back into the earth. "We need samples," Emmett said. Clara pulled out a thin swab kit from her pocket. "Already ahead of you." While Emmett stood watch, she swabbed the vent grate and tucked the cotton into a sterile vial. Valor circled once, ears high, alert to any sound. No guards, no security system she could see. "This isn't a campaign headquarters," she muttered. "It's a lab." They slipped away through the tree line just as a car pulled up the gravel drive. Clara caught a glimpse of the driver, tall, with silver hair and an immaculate tan overcoat. Whitman. Back at the cabin that evening, the fire crackled low, and Rosie slept curled under Valor's chin on the rug. Ivy Monroe sat at the dining table, flipping through Dana Lorne's notebook, her pen moving quickly across her own reporter's journal. She was in her mid-30s, with olive-toned skin, curly dark hair pinned up loosely, and eyes that missed nothing. A former investigative journalist for the Oregon Tribune, she'd been blacklisted after exposing corruption in a pharmaceutical trial 5 years ago. Quiet but relentless, Ivy had spent the last 2 years following whispers of illegal chemical testing in the rural Pacific Northwest. "This confirms everything I've been chasing," she said, not looking up. Unregistered compounds, environmental leaks, human disappearances filed as relocations. It's bigger than Omnitech. Clara leaned back in her chair, exhausted. And Whitman's right in the middle of it. "They're using the mayor's office to launder legitimacy," Ivy said. "No oversight, no press, no access." Clara looked to Valor, who now snored softly beside Rosie. "They underestimated him. And they underestimated you," Ivy added. Clara stood, moved to the window, and stared into the dark forest. Then, let's show them what a mistake that was. The Redwood Hollow Town Hall hadn't seen this many people in years. Folding chairs stretched row after row beneath the old brass chandeliers, which swayed slightly in the breeze sneaking through the warped window frames. A hush had settled like dust, heavy and expectant. Clara stood near the center aisle, the folder of evidence in her hand trembling not from fear, but from restrained conviction. Beside her sat Rosie, her feet swinging above the floor. Valor curled quietly at her side like a sentinel carved from gold in storm. At the far end of the room, the town council sat elevated behind a curved oak bench. 5 members, all aging, all familiar. At the center was Councilwoman Evelyn Myers, a wiry woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a severe twist, known for her no-nonsense demeanor and a history of standing alone when others bent. Her sharp green eyes flicked from Clara to the documents in front of her, betraying no emotion. Beside her sat Councilman Paul White, round-faced, cautious, always fiddling with the edge of his tie, and 3 others whose names Clara barely remembered but whose political silence had spoken volumes for years. At the corner of the council chamber stood Martin Keller, Omnitech's lawyer, a man in his 50s, rail-thin with slicked black hair and a penchant for custom-tailored suits. His voice was smooth as varnish and about as warm. Clara had dealt with men like him in courtrooms before, professional skeptics trained to reduce truth to technicality. Councilwoman Myers gavelled the room to silence. "Officer Hayes, you may proceed." Clara stood slowly, stepped forward, and placed a printed exhibit onto the evidence table. It was a blown-up photo of one of the vials they had recovered, its masking tape label clearly visible. These were found buried beneath a decommissioned Omnitech facility, which, according to property records, was never cleared or decontaminated. Inside the same container was the journal of Dana Lorne, former biologist and whistleblower, now missing. Martin Keller adjusted his glasses. "Objection, Chair. Officer Hayes is offering speculation. The journal has not been authenticated by any official lab, and Ms. Lorne has not been confirmed as deceased." "She has been confirmed missing for over 2 years," Clara replied, "and her daughter is sitting right there." Martin turned smoothly. "A child's memory isn't admissible as factual record." Councilman White spoke up, voice hesitant. "Let's allow Officer Hayes to continue. This is an open hearing." Clara nodded gratefully, flipping to a second image. This one of the warehouse's floor vent, the sample bag beside it. "We also found active traces of banned organophosphate compounds beneath Mayor Whitman's campaign headquarters, which Valor A retired K-9 trained in chemical detection identified unprompted." A soft laugh echoed across the room. It came from the Omnitech bench. Martin stepped forward, clearly emboldened. "With all due respect, Chair, we are now relying on the testimony of a dog, a retired, unverified, non-human witness, guided by an officer who, need I remind, this chamber was discharged with a record of trauma and disciplinary flags." A murmur rose from the spectators. Clara swallowed the sting in her chest. "Those flags were cleared," she said. "I was injured in the line of duty investigating this very trail. And Valor isn't a pet, he's trained to alert on danger, and he hasn't forgotten that training." Martin's smile was slow, cruel. "Yes, but memory canines are human, isn't evidence." There was a stillness then. The kind that falls before someone speaks up not because they are ready, but because they can't not speak. Rosie stood. The room turned. Her voice wavered at first. "I saw Mr. Hayes give money to a police officer. I took a picture. I gave it to Clara. It's real. And my mom's handwriting is in that book. She always did hearts on the corners." Martin began, "Miss, with all compassion, you're 7. She used to come home crying," Rosie continued, louder now. "She said they were testing things on animals. She told me she was trying to stop it, and then she never came home." The room was silent. A silence not born of doubt, but recognition. Clara placed Rosie's photo on the exhibit stand. "This was taken before the auction. That's Dalton Hayes, now missing, and Officer Delaney, who is currently under internal investigation. We're not just talking about environmental risk anymore. We're talking about obstruction, corporate manipulation, and possibly worse." At the back of the room, Ivy Monroe stood discreetly, phone in hand. Dressed in a dark turtleneck and trench coat, her curly hair tucked under a knit cap, she blended easily with the crowd. The live stream was quiet, but the counter at the bottom of the screen ticked up, hundreds watching, then thousands. Ivy didn't speak. She just let the camera bear witness. Councilwoman Myers adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Keller, do you deny that the warehouse site belonged to Omnitech?" "No," Martin said carefully. but our records show no knowledge of unauthorized testing. If these vials exist, they are the responsibility of the site manager at the time, who is no longer employed. Without chain of custody, the evidence is circumstantial." Clara's jaw clenched. "What about the campaign headquarters? Will you deny the chemical readings we obtained there?" "Even if such readings existed, it's an old building," Martin replied. "Could be from any prior tenant. You're saying a political campaign is leasing space laced with hazardous materials, and no one checked?" He didn't answer. Myers leaned forward, her voice cutting. "What about Miss Lorne's disappearance?" Martin hesitated. "Unrelated. She wasn't even officially employed. She was contracted. Her name's on the permit. You erased her," Clara said. "Speculation," Martin snapped. Rosie looked around, voice soft now. "No, it's memory." There was a long pause. Then Councilman White spoke. "We'll review this further. But until then, I move we place a stay on all Omnitech-affiliated development in Redwood Hollow and freeze campaign assets tied to suspected chemical sites." The crowd murmured. Evelyn Myers looked at each council member. One by one, they nodded. "Motion passed," she said. Meeting adjourned. As Clara turned to gather her things, Rosie clutched her hand, and Valor stood beside them like a living monument to all that could not be silenced. And in the back of the room, Ivy's stream ticked upward, 50,000 views and rising. The town was finally listening. It was early spring, when the flags were lowered from half-mast, and the frost finally let go of Redwood Hollow's soil. The courthouse bell rang crisp and clean through the square as a small crowd gathered on the sun-warmed steps. Clara stood near the base, her dark navy jacket newly pressed, badge clipped but no longer the burden it once was. Her hair was tied neatly back, a few stubborn strands catching the breeze. She no longer wore the expression of someone bracing for a fight. There was still steel in her eyes, but now it was wrapped in purpose, not pain. Beside her sat Valor, his coat brushed and gleaming in the sunlight, though the silver around his muzzle had grown more pronounced. He was calm, regal, as if aware of the importance of this moment. A red scarf, embroidered with the K9 therapy emblem, hung lightly around his neck. Children nearby whispered and pointed, not with fear or curiosity, but awe. Across the square, banners had been taken down. The campaign headquarters of Mayor Whitman now stood boarded and silent. The man himself was under federal investigation, removed from office pending charges related to environmental violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to falsify public records. The Omnitech site had been sealed by state health officials, and the chemical samples Clara submitted were being used in a multi-agency inquiry that reached far beyond Redwood Hollow. Today wasn't about trials or justice systems. Today was about what came after. As the crowd quieted, Clara stepped forward and knelt beside Valor, placing a medal, a small gold tag etched with the words service. Loyalty. Legacy on his collar. "You earned this, partner," she whispered. Then came the applause. Not thunderous, not dramatic, gentle, grateful, lasting. Later that afternoon, the sun followed Clara, Emmett, and Rosie as they walked the winding gravel path toward a newly painted wooden sign. Redwood Hollow K9 Center. Training for Hope. The building behind it was modest, a converted stable with clean kennels, classrooms, and an open yard surrounded by cedar fencing. Inside, laughter echoed off the beams as 3 children in wheelchairs navigated the training course with tiny shepherd pups trotting beside them. One of them, Caleb, 9 years old with spiky brown hair and a prosthetic leg, held a clicker in one hand and a biscuit in the other. "Sit," he said firmly. The pup complied. Caleb beamed. Clara leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Her new role as program director fit her like a second, skin-structured, meaningful, with just enough unpredictability to keep her sharp. She worked with Emmett, now retired full-time from carpentry, who helped design agility courses and made custom wooden aids for mobility-challenged dogs. Valor had been officially certified as a therapy companion and now spent his days between Clara's side and the paws of kids like Caleb. He was patient, intuitive, and gentle, especially with those who were quietest. Rosie was never quiet. She darted across the center with her ever-present camera slung around her neck and paint smudges on her sleeves. Now, 8, she had grown bolder, steadier. At home, she'd started decorating her bedroom walls with Polaroid snapshots of Valor teaching kids to trust again, of Clara laughing over coffee, of Emmett asleep with a puppy on his chest. Her favorite photo framed on her nightstand was of Valor during the hearing, sitting like a statue beside Clara under the glare of the town council lights. She called it The Day the Dog Spoke. Rosie was legally in Clara and Emmett's custody now, and although paperwork and court visits had filled the months after the hearing, it was the little things, late-night pancakes, art supply runs, quiet tears on stormy nights that had cemented them into a family. That evening, as the sky turned the color of ash and lavender, they gathered on the front porch of the cabin. Rosie leaned against Clara, wrapped in a quilt, her head heavy on Clara's shoulder. Emmett rocked slowly in the chair beside them, sipping sweet tea. Valor lay at Clara's feet, head resting over her boots, breath even and slow. Ivy's article went viral, Emmett said, glancing up from his phone. Front page of 2 syndicates. She's already getting threats. She expected that, Clara replied. She said if she doesn't ruffle the right cages, she's not doing it right. She coming back through town? Next week, wants to do a follow-up story on the K-9 program. Rosie yawned. She better put in the bit about how Valor loves peanut butter. They laughed. Then quiet came again, not uncomfortable but complete. After a while, Clara stood and stepped off the porch. The field stretched before her, tall grass catching the dusk light like golden threads. She knelt beside Valor and looked into his eyes. "We did it," she said softly. He nuzzled her chin, tail thumping once against the porch. She smiled and added, "And we're not done." Not all battles came with bullets. Some came with silence, and it took a dog to break it. Not a tool, not a weapon. Just a partner who refused to forget what mattered most. And in a quiet town that once tried to bury the truth, it was that dog-old scarred loyal who helped them dig it back up. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles wrapped in lightning or grand signs from the sky. Sometimes, He sends them on 4 legs, with eyes that see beyond pain and a heart that never gives up on the forgotten. Valor wasn't just a dog. He was a vessel of loyalty, a whisper of truth, and a reminder that honor doesn't fade with age or scars or silence. Through Clara's fight, Rosie's courage, and Emmett's quiet strength, we witnessed what happens when ordinary people choose to do the right thing even when it's hard. In a world so often clouded by power and fear, it was a child's voice, a veteran's devotion, and the unspoken bond of a dog that brought the light back in. And maybe that's the miracle, that truth still lives, that justice still breathes, that loyalty, even after all it's endured, still shows up, tail wagging and eyes full of love. If this story moved you, take a moment now. Comment Amen if you believe God still works through the quiet ones, the forgotten, the faithful, the 4-legged. Share this story to remind someone that goodness exists. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and redemption. And above all, may God bless you and protect those you love, including the animals who walk beside us, silently carrying our burdens. Amen.